A few years ago, most of us were probably unaware of the existence of this word permacrisis. You could probably work out what it means, that it's got something to do with being in a permanent crisis or just lurching from one unprecedented event to another. And permacrisis is certainly a good way of describing the last few years, certainly here in the UK. Some of those things have been self-inflicted wounds, but some have been global events out of our control, such as the coronavirus pandemic or the war in Ukraine. And over the last 12 months, we've welcomed into our church family those who've had to leave their homes either because of war or because of oppressive government crackdowns. Unprecedented crisis in their lives. This last week, we've had snow, and our car thermometer has shown minus 11.5 on 2 days, and I've never experienced it that cold before. But within that context, many of us haven't had the heating on as much as we might like. People are fearful of what the future holds. Food banks are in demand like never before. And maybe you're thinking, well, I know all of this. You don't need me to remind you of this. You're bombarded with doom and gloom all day long. And you thought, I'm going to come to church. I'm going to sing some Christmas carols. I'm going to forget about all that stuff for an hour or so. And I'm going to go home and I'm going to feel better. Because you weren't expected to be reminded of just how bad it is. But we're not here this morning to escape from reality. We're not here to sing some carols so that we can feel better for a few minutes. When we put aside the Christmas card images and the dodgy Christmas carol-related theology, when we put all that to one side, we're left with a story that has permacrisis written all over it. We have a story where the main characters lurch from one unprecedented crisis to another. They are part of a people who have been oppressed. They live as part of a poor agricultural community, subsistence farmers, just one drought or one flood or one locust swarm away from disaster. Last week, we finished off a series from the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, which is almost the last book written in the Old Testament. Malachi was written just a few years later. But after that, God said nothing for 400 years. And so God's people were living through a permacrisis. Many of them would have given up hope. Many would have been asking, where is God in all of this? Where is God? And the good news of the Christmas story is that God chose to be right there in the middle of the permacrisis with them and with us. I'm just going to watch a short video.
God didn't speak to his people for 400 years. He was silent. Nothing. It started around 430 BC when God's final words came from Malachi, which displayed both his kindness and his severity. Judgment is coming. But for those who believe, it says, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings. That's pretty much it. 400 years. Silence. So then what happened? Though the Jewish people had rebuilt the temple and restored the law, all was not well. They had wandered from God. His ways were far from their hearts, and centuries of hardships were upon them. First, they fell to the Greeks, and then to the Egyptians, and then to the Syrians, who persecuted them greatly. The temple was desecrated. Tens of thousands of God's people were slaughtered. All the while, silence. Where's God? On one hand, I would think that those years would drive God's people to study Scripture, to seek God, to cling to His promises. Instead, God's people became deaf and blind, unable to fathom what was coming. I wonder if they yearned for the days when God wasn't silent, when He spoke through prophets, angels, dreams, and burning bushes. I wonder if they looked up to the sky and pleaded, God, deliver us. We'll respond the right way this time. Can't you see that we need you? Silence. Generations came and went. Hope for many was lost, but it was about to return in a most unexpected way. God was writing a new law while simultaneously fulfilling the old. Its ink would drip with love. Its pages would be filled with hope. You see, God had always been at work. The silence, which had been deafening for so long, was about to end with the sound of a heartbeat.
I'm sure that the first Christmas was neither silent nor calm. But we're going to stand together and we're going to worship God as He broke those 400 years of silence with the sound of a heartbeat as we sing Silent Night. Children, do you still have your awful and your amazing cards? Because I thought we would play an awful or amazing Christmas quiz. I'm going to show you a series of pictures on the screen related to Christmas, and you have to tell me, in your opinion, whether they are awful or whether they are amazing. And the rest of you can join in as well. So if you think that something is awful, you're going to point over to this wall. So you're going to do your left hands. And if you think something is amazing, you're going to point to this wall. Okay, everyone understand? So, first up, Brussels sprouts. Awful or amazing? And some of you may never have had a Brussels sprout before, and if that's you, then you can find out this Christmas for yourself whether they are awful or amazing. Okay, so we have a mixed response. Probably a slightly more awfuls being held up than amazings. What about mince pies? Awful or amazing? Well, I think I'm in a minority here. I think and there's a few awfuls, but most are amazing. Right. What about Christmas songs? I'm not just talking about carols. I'm talking about Wham and Slade. And so is it amazing, or are you just waiting for it all to be over and just get back to normal stuff on the radio? Some of you are even waving both. Right. Awful or amazing? Now, having to stay in bed until a certain time on Christmas morning. Is that awful? Now, there is a not unsurprising split between parents and children on this one. But and then one last one. Christmas jumpers. Are they awful or are they amazing? I am going to keep my opinion to myself for fear of offending a number of people who were stood at the front slightly earlier on. But there are various things to do with Christmas, some of which we might think are awful, some of which we might think are amazing. Earlier on, we heard part of the Christmas story retold by our young people, and how it was a real mix, a real roller coaster for those who were involved in the story between those moments that were awful and those moments that were amazing. And some of those moments would have been both awful and amazing, all mixed up mixed up at the same time. The people of Israel had an awful time. They were waiting, or they'd been waiting for God to do something amazing. They'd been waiting for 400 years, and so most people had probably given up hope. But not everyone. There were still some people who held on to God's promises and who believed that God would do the things that he said he would do. And some of these people occasionally pop up in the story if we were to read it all through. People like Simeon and Anna, who we briefly mentioned last week. We read about them in the next section of Luke's Christmas story. People like Mary, who, although she had questions about what the angel was saying to her, she trusted God. She submitted to God's plan for her. Now, I don't believe for a minute that the shepherds living out in the fields nearby were remotely interested in Old Testament prophecies. They knew life was tough, but they weren't expecting God to do anything about it. When they sat around their campfire at night, they were not discussing religion. They weren't remembering Old Testament prophecies. These were guys who were right on the fringe of society, and they were right on the fringe of society for a reason. You could throw a shepherd further than you trust him. And one of the amazing things, not just about the Christmas story, but about the whole of the gospel story, which talks to us about the life of Jesus, is that this story continually involves people who you wouldn't expect to be there. The angels tell the shepherds that something amazing has happened. The one who had been prophesied hundreds of years before, the Messiah, the one who would save the people, he had finally been born. And this is good news, and it is going to be great joy for all people. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. You know, trickle-down anything doesn't really work. You know, life for Herod was pretty good. And he didn't really like the idea of there being a new king in town. And he wanted to hold on to all that he had. He wanted to hold on to his wealth. He wanted to hold on to his power. He wanted to hold on to his influence. He didn't want any of that trickling down to anyone else. And so the angels took this amazing news to those who were at the bottom of the pile. Those for whom life was, generally speaking, pretty awful. Those for whom life was always right on the edge, always just one crisis away from disaster. And into their story, God brings good news. Into their story, God brings joy. And into their story, God brings peace. Because if we were to continue to read the story on through the rest of the Gospels, we would discover that this baby isn't just an ordinary baby. This baby is God himself, born to parents who are at the bottom of the pile, born into poverty. And whether he was born in a stable or born in a cave or born in a downstairs room in a relative's house, he was born into a space that wasn't designed for human habitation. It was a place where the animals slept. Soon he would be fleeing with his parents to Egypt as Herod sought to remove this threat to his throne. Today, we'd call him a refugee or an asylum seeker. And then as this baby grew into a man, he continued to meet with the most unexpected people. People that most people would have nothing to do with. Obviously, this is Christmas. But Christmas doesn't make any sense without Easter. The most awful of days followed by the most amazing of days. A time when the one who many people believed he was the one who had come to save them, and yet he was killed as a criminal on a Roman cross. Dead and buried. All hopes dashed. Yet another false dawn. And yet that awful day was followed a few days later by the most amazing day, as he came back to life, defeating death once and for all. And when you read through the rest of the New Testament story, the story of those first people who chose to follow Jesus, you see that their lives were often awful and amazing at the same time. When you read about some of the things that happened to them, the fact that they were persecuted, that they were put in prison, that they had to leave and flee their homes, some were even killed, it is awful. But through those experiences, in those experiences, they knew the amazing joy and the amazing peace that only God could give them. And so they were able to sing God's praise whilst chained up in prison. They were able to sleep soundly whilst chained between Roman guards awaiting their execution. Because God was with them where they were. They had a hope for the future. And the amazing truth of the Christmas story is that we can know this peace. We can know this joy. We can know this hope. Jesus was born to save his people from their sins. And he would do that through his death on a cross 30-something years after he was born. And when we believe that this death was for us, when we say sorry for going our own way, when we decide that from now on I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to pledge my allegiance to him, then we can know this peace and we can know this joy. We can know this hope and we can know this love for ourselves. We can know God with us. So as you look ahead to this Christmas time, whether you're expecting it to be amazing or whether you're dreading that it will be awful, make sure that you don't miss out on the hope and on the joy and on the peace and on the love that can be ours because of Jesus, no matter what this Christmas brings. Let's pray.